On the day the world danced in the streets, one man sat in the dark plotting the next apocalypse. While the champagne corks popped in Trafalgar Square and mothers wept with relief that the killing was finally over, Winston Churchill was drafting the death warrant for another million men. The history books tell us that May 8, 1945, was the end of the nightmare. They are wrong. For the British Prime Minister, it was merely the intermission before a war that would make the fight against Hitler look like a skirmish. The file is thick, stamped with the highest classification of the British Empire, top secret. It sat unopened for 50 years, buried in the deepest vaults of the National Archives. It details a betrayal so profound, so staggering in its scale that even today it seems like the fiction of a madman. But it was real. While British and Soviet soldiers were embracing on the banks of the Elbe, sharing vodka and cigarettes, their leaders were preparing to order them to slaughter each other. To understand this madness, we must descend into the cabinet war rooms beneath the streets of London. It is May 8, 1945, VE Day. Above ground, the air is filled with the roar of victory. Below ground, the air is stale, heavy with cigar smoke and dread. Winston Churchill stands before the great map of Europe. He does not see a liberated continent. He sees a red tide that has swallowed everything from Warsaw to Berlin. He sees the Soviet Red Army, a colossal machine of 11 million men resting on the ruins of the Third Reich. They are not moving. They are digging in. Churchill realizes with a cold, terrifying clarity that the defeat of Germany has created a vacuum that Stalin is rapidly filling. The Iron Curtain has not yet been named, but Churchill can already feel its cold shadow falling across the West. He knows that if the Americans withdraw their forces as promised, there will be nothing standing between the Russian tanks and the English Channel. In that moment of silent panic, the Prime Minister makes a decision that defies all logic of alliance and honor. He decides that the only way to save the future is to destroy the present peace. He turns to his bewildered military chiefs and issues an order that freezes the blood in their veins. He does not ask for a defensive strategy. He demands a plan for a full-scale Anglo-American invasion of the Soviet Union. The target date is not in a year or in 6 months. It is July 1st, 1945. 2 weeks after the surrender of Germany, the telegrams were still flying between London, Washington, and Moscow, full of congratulations and promises of eternal friendship. But on May 22nd, 1945, a very different document was circulating through the corridors of Whitehall. It was a directive from the Prime Minister to the Joint Planning Staff. It did not carry the usual diplomatic pleasantries. It was a cold, hard instrument of war designed to shatter the very alliance that had just saved the world. Churchill was not asking for a contingency plan. He was demanding a feasibility study for an unprovoked surprise attack. The document, which would soon bear the chilling codename Operation Unthinkable, laid out the parameters with terrifying simplicity. The objective was defined in a single brutal sentence: to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire. Let those words sink in. To impose the will. This is not the language of defense. This is not the language of containment. It is the language of conquest. It is the language of an aggressor preparing to launch a total war against a sovereign nation. And this nation was not a stranger. It was the ally that had just sacrificed 20 million of its own people to destroy the Nazi war machine. The directive operated on a staggering assumption. Churchill knew that Britain, bankrupt and exhausted, could not fight the Russian bear alone. The plan required, as a fundamental necessity, the full military support of the United States. He was gambling on the idea that President Truman, new to the office and wary of Stalin, could be convinced to turn his guns on the East. It was a gamble of breathtaking arrogance. The British military chiefs who received this order must have stared at the paper in disbelief. They were professional soldiers. They knew the reality of the battlefield. They knew that the Red Army was not a disorganized rabble. It was the most battle-hardened force in human history, currently occupying half of Europe. And yet, their prime minister was ordering them to find a way to break it, to drive it back, to start World War III before the ink on the peace treaties was even dry. The deadline Churchill set for this madness was not just ambitious. It was a death sentence. The operational date for the start of hostilities was set for July 1st, 1945. It is a date that carries no weight in our history books, but in the secret files of the War Cabinet, it marks the beginning of the apocalypse that almost was. Consider the reality of that timeline. The planners in London were staring at a calendar that gave them less than 6 weeks to pivot the entire British war machine from a posture of celebration to a posture of total aggression. 6 weeks to reorganize supply lines that stretched across an ocean. 6 weeks to retrain men who had spent years fighting Nazis to fight their own allies. On the ground in Germany, the situation was surreal. British and American troops were intermingled with Soviet forces along the River Elbe. They were sharing rations, trading wristwatches for vodka, and playing football in the ruins of German towns. They were brothers in arms who had just defeated the ultimate evil. And yet, if the orders from London were to be followed, in 40 days these same British soldiers would have to look into the eyes of the men they were drinking with and pull the trigger. The logistical nightmare was absolute. To launch a surprise attack on July 1st meant that the movement of troops and ammunition had to begin immediately, in total secrecy, while maintaining the facade of friendship. It meant that every handshake on the Elbe was a lie. It meant that while diplomats were toasting to the New World Order, the military was quietly loading the guns to destroy it. The planners knew that once the first shot was fired, there would be no turning back. The element of surprise was their only weapon, but it was a double-edged sword. To use it, they had to commit the ultimate betrayal before the victory parades had even finished marching through London. As the joint planning staff stared at the maps in the smoky basement of Whitehall, the cold arithmetic of war began to crush them. They had 47 divisions available for the assault: British, American, Canadian, and Polish. It sounded like a mighty host until they looked at what stood against them. The Soviet Union had over 170 divisions in the theater. The Red Army was a steamroller of men and steel that stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The Allies were outnumbered 3-1 in infantry and 2-1 in armor. The planners realized with sinking hearts that if they attacked with their current forces, they would not be imposing their will. They would be feeding their armies into a meat grinder. To fill this gaping void in manpower, the planners reached for a solution so grotesque that it remains a stain on the conscience of the British Empire. They did not ask for more American drafts. They did not call up the Home Guard. They looked to the prisoner of war camps. The proposal, written in black and white in the Operation Unthinkable file, called for the immediate rearmament of 100,000 German soldiers. The very men who had burned Europe, who had operated the camps, who had fought to the death in Berlin just days ago, were to be dusted off, given back their Mausers, and marched back into Poland. This was the unholy alliance in its rawest form. The plan envisioned British officers standing side by side with Wehrmacht veterans, perhaps even SS units, fighting a common enemy. It was a betrayal of every moral principle the war had been fought to uphold. The uniform of the enemy was to be swapped for the uniform of the ally in the blink of an eye. For Churchill, the fear of Stalin was so consuming that he was willing to make a pact with the devil he had just destroyed. The defeat of Nazism was suddenly secondary to the defeat of communism, even if it meant resurrecting the Wehrmacht to do the dirty work. Between May 25th and June 5th, The British military chiefs engaged in the most terrifying war game in history. In the silent, windowless rooms beneath London, the slide rules were moving and the results were turning the faces of seasoned generals pale. They were trying to solve an equation that had no answer. They were trying to find a way for 47 divisions to push back a tide of steel that stretched to the horizon. They called the Soviet forces the Red Steamroller, and the name was not a metaphor. It was a statistical reality. The intelligence reports laid out the grim calculus of suicide. The Soviet Union had over 6 million men in the European theater alone. They possessed a 3-to-1 advantage in infantry. Their tank superiority was overwhelming, not just in numbers but in quality. The T-34 and the heavy Stalin tanks were monsters that had chewed up the best panzer divisions Germany could throw at them. The Allied Sherman tanks, by comparison, were thin-skinned toys. The planners simulated the attack. They drew the arrows on the maps, thrusting into Poland toward the city of Dresden. In every scenario, the initial surprise attack achieved a momentary gain. And in every scenario, the Soviet counterattack was apocalyptic. The Red Army would not just hold the line, they would encircle and annihilate the attacking force. The simulations showed the Allied front collapsing under the sheer weight of Russian artillery and armor. But the horror did not stop at the front lines. The staff calculated that to achieve even limited success, a vague term that meant avoiding immediate destruction, would require the total mobilization of the British Empire and the United States for a war that would last years. There would be no quick victory. There would be no surrender in Moscow. The war would drag on into the freezing Vietnamness of the Russian winter, the same white hell that had swallowed Napoleon and Hitler. The planners realized they were not preparing a strategy for victory. They were drafting a suicide note for the Western world. On June 8, 1945, the fever dream finally broke. The British Chiefs of Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Admiral Cunningham, and Air Chief Marshal Portal, delivered their final verdict to Winston Churchill. It was a document devoid of hope, a cold bucket of water thrown onto the Prime Minister's fiery ambition. The report was not just a rejection, it was a dismantle of the very concept of Operation Unthinkable. They laid out their conclusion with the brutal honesty of men who knew they would be the ones ordering soldiers to die. The chiefs stated unequivocally that a quick success was a fantasy. They warned that the moment the first Allied tank crossed the line into Soviet-occupied territory, the conflict would spiral out of control. It would not be a limited engagement to liberate Poland. It would trigger total war. The report painted a picture of a conflict that would consume the globe, dragging the exhausted populations of Britain and America into a struggle that might last for a decade. They warned that the Red Army, with its vast reserves of manpower and interior lines of communication, was unbeatable in a land war on the continent. But the most damning assessment was political. The generals asked a question that Churchill, in his obsession, had failed to answer. How do you sell this war to the people? How do you tell a British mother whose son just survived the beaches of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes that he must now march into the Russian winter to fight the very people he had celebrated as heroes a month ago? The chiefs concluded that the morale of the Allied troops would shatter. The American public would revolt. The British economy would collapse. The final paragraph of the report was a tombstone for the operation. The chiefs wrote that, "We consider the opening of hostilities with Russia to be highly improbable to achieve our object, and we would become involved in a war which we could not win." It was the military equivalent of an intervention. They were telling the most powerful man in the British Empire that his plan was not bold, it was insane. The logic was irrefutable. The plan to betray Stalin was militarily unfeasible and politically suicidal. Churchill read the report, and for the first time in weeks, the map on the wall did not look like a chessboard. It looked like a graveyard. Winston Churchill was a man of immense ego, but he was not a fool. When the chiefs of staff told him that attacking the Soviet Union would lead to the destruction of the British Army, he listened. On June 10, 1945, the offensive phase of Operation Unthinkable was officially declared dead. The dream of driving the Red Army back to Russia was abandoned. But the fear that had birthed it did not vanish. It merely mutated. The Prime Minister's paranoia shifted from what Britain could do to Stalin to what Stalin might do to Britain. The operational maps in the War Cabinet were not rolled up. They were redrawn. The arrows that had pointed east or toward Poland and the Soviet lines were erased. In their place, new arrows appeared pointing west toward the North Sea and the English Channel. The planners were ordered to prepare for the nightmare scenario. A Soviet blitzkrieg across the scorched plains of Germany, sweeping the remaining Allied forces into the sea. The offensive plan became a desperate defensive contingency. The question changed from how do we attack to how long can we survive? The answer was terrifyingly short. The new assessments concluded that if the Red Army decided to march, they could reach the coast of France in a matter of weeks. The British forces, outnumbered and outgunned, would be fighting a retreat across a continent they had just spent a year liberating. The planners quietly noted that the use of special weapons, the atomic bomb, though not yet fully revealed, might be the only thing that could stop the Soviet tide. This defensive plan, a document of pure existential dread, was treated with even more secrecy than the offensive one. It was not just classified top secret. It was marked deeply buried. It was locked in a safe to which only a handful of men held the key. It was a file that admitted the West was terrified of its own ally. While the newspapers were still printing headlines about the unbreakable bond between the Big Three, the British military was preparing for the day when that bond would snap and the tanks would start rolling again. The file sat in the dark, a silent testament to the fact that the peace of 1945 was built on a foundation of absolute paralyzing fear. On July 17, 1945, the ruins of the German Reich were the backdrop for a field act of theater. At the Potsdam Conference, Winston Churchill sat across the table from Joseph Stalin. The cameras clicked, capturing images of the Big Three, Churchill, Stalin, and President Truman, smiling, shaking hands, and carving up the map of the post-war world. To the public, it was the summit of peace. But to the few men who knew the contents of the deeply buried file, it was a masquerade. As Churchill puffed on his cigar and traded pleasantries with the Soviet dictator, the ghost of July 1st hung in the air between them. Only 17 days earlier, if the Prime Minister had gotten his way, the British tanks guarding the conference perimeter would not have been standing idle. They would have been rolling east, spearheading an attack to destroy the very man Churchill was now toasting. Every handshake was a deception. Every agreement on borders was drafted by a man who had, just weeks prior, authorized a plan to erase those borders with high explosives. The Cold War did not begin with the Berlin blockade or the Iron Curtain speech. It did not begin with spies in alleyways or nuclear standoffs. It began right there at that table in Potsdam, fueled by a secret that remained locked away for 53 years. The betrayal had already happened, not on the battlefield, but in the mind. The West had looked at its ally and seen an enemy so terrifying that they considered recruiting the Wehrmacht to fight him. Operation Unthinkable was shelved, but its spirit survived. The trust was broken before the war was even officially over. Churchill would lose the general election just days later, replaced by Clement Attlee. He left office knowing that the unthinkable plan was gathering dust in a safe, a silent testament to how close the world came to a catastrophe that would have made the Second World War look like a prelude. The millions of soldiers celebrating their survival had no idea that their leaders had almost spent their lives in a gamble for global dominance. The peace we lived in for half a century was not born of friendship. It was born of fear held together by the terrified realization that the alternative was the end of civilization. The evidence is fragmented. Some details remain disputed, but the core facts are documented in military archives, witness testimonies, and declassified files. And now, when the story is told, the silence feels especially heavy. Before my eyes, I still see that map in the war room, the one with the arrows pointing east and the terrifying calculations of casualties that never happen. That is exactly why I cannot simply close this file and forget. Because forgetting is the final betrayal we can commit toward those millions of soldiers who were almost sacrificed on the altar of a secret war. If you listen to the end, it means this matters to you too. Just let me know you're here, that I'm not telling this into the void.